Ready for the next bit? So, second half is going to be about time and timing. And I mentioned that to Paul last week, and he laughed out loud because he's noticed that I tend to overrun. What do I do? But I've worked out what it is. I do 2 hours, and then the extra quarter of an hour for a break. That's where the extra comes from. Anyway, I'll try and finish within about 3/4 of an hour so we can get off at a reasonable time. But yeah, time and timing. The most often asked question in a question and answer gardener's question type scenario is, when do I do this and when do I do that? And of course, part of the answer depends on where you live. Because if you're in Somerset, it's one answer. If you're in Scotland, it's got to be another answer. Again, 6 weeks later, about 6 weeks later. But yeah, this is, underpinning what I'm doing all the time is I do hope that people don't end up wasting a lot of time. And over the years, that's been a general comment, and that with more people growing now, my concern is that they'll rush off to the garden centre and spend thousands of pounds, and then not a lot of it, some of it might not work, and they've actually wasted that time. So wasting time would be the kind of worst scenario. But yeah, we've had this first half in terms of continuity, growing as many diverse things as you can, changing your actual diet and taste and expectations to suit what will grow. But yeah, thinking about the cycle, first of the whole year, and that's the calendar year that we're used to, with long and short days. And then also within that, the approach and the concept we've got of months, weeks and days as well. So it's partly on a short-term basis about how we use our time during the day, and that gives us an indication in terms of the day length is increasing very quickly at the moment. Just before and after the equinoxes in end of March and also in September, that's when day length changes quickest. So for 3 weeks before and after equinox, that's when the days are changing very quickly. So 3 weeks after equinox, by the end of April, we'll be virtually on summer hours, which will be nearly 15, 16 hours of sunlight a day. But we're only just still recovering from hibernation and cold winters and that kind of thing. And yeah, this is to try and give you a bit of an insight into how to approach the whole question of the growing season, and also within that, how to prioritise your time, hopefully to do things the right way. And the point I made at the start, that this is just words until you put it into practice. And for me, it took maybe 3 or 4 growing seasons, growing years, before I really got latched on to doing the right things at the right time. And I was just describing that, in terms of the weather and the perception of warmth. I did this myself in the first year or two I was growing. In February, there was a nice day, and it was lovely and warm. And I went out and sowed things, and then I realised that the last frost was going to be in 2 months' time after that. So I'd actually wasted my time trying to get ahead and trying to do too much too early. And actually the continuity that you've just experienced of eating all that stuff, well, that's all come from the work that I did last year. So that's carrying over from last year. That's not kind of hard work that I've already done this year. And hard work is almost anathema if we can make it as little as possible.
A friend of mine has a heated greenhouse. She starts most things off in little pots, even parsnips. She uses cardboard. So that's the urge to care, and she wants to look after things and nurture things and do well by them. But actually, by doing that, later on, she's going to have to be cruel to them and take them from this lovely, warm, hot environment and stick them outside. She can't grow them in the greenhouse throughout their life. And also, illustrating, it's starting things off too early. What you're aiming to, if you've got extra heat or light, is that those plants don't get too big by the time the weather warms up outside and they converge with what's going on outside. So that rather than having a sudden shock, and it's 2 months earlier in temperature terms, and that can, in many cases, trigger flowering, and therefore things like celeriac, also parsnips, I can imagine, they'll think they're going through winter, and after that they'll flower in the summer instead of getting a crop.
So it's illustrating that, and also the use of space, that's precious space, heated greenhouse. So I'd restrict that just to using for things like aubergines and peppers, which I'd sow in January, tomatoes, which I'd sow in February, so they're seedlings now. But anything else, it's much better practice if it's outdoor hardy to sow it direct. In the case of parsnips, sow it straight into a seed bed, and then the seed root can get established where it wants, where it's going to grow. Whenever you transplant the root, you're in danger of damaging it and therefore not getting straight parsnips. You're also illustrating scale in terms of, if you're working on a really small scale and you just want a couple of dozen parsnips or whatever it is, and you have the time to do the extra work you need to raise it in a pot, to prick it out, to pot it on, and then to plant it out, which means 4 or 5 or 6, many times more work, much more time going into it than you really need. So to grow a crop of parsnips, good soil preparation through the winter, and then direct sowing, and that could be any time from now on. They're quite hardy seeds, take a long time to germinate. But also the stage of development that your friend's at, in terms of she wants to nurture everything, maybe too much. And things can be killed by too much kindness, that kind of thing. So,
for the rest of us, if you sow it on the windowsill on the side as well, it's too dark, well, then they get really spindly and they're not helpful.
So it's that thing about convergence again.
You have to wait for the light to come, even if you're going to start it on the side.
Yeah, it might look like you've got a big plant, but actually it's getting spindly, etiolated, not enough light.
Well, I don't
and that's
know
fragile in terms of compared to the growth you get outside.
I don't know her whole experience, but what struck me is that I go around her garden and hers, but she does actually make them from further on.
Yeah. But it's whether you can sustain that amount of nurturing throughout the life of the crop, or to get them independent and self-growing. Next week, I'll refer to a book, and it's How to Bring Up Plants, and it's imagine that the plants are your children. And rather than creating, mollycoddled plants that are dependent on you all the time and keep on crying and keeping you awake at night and still need looking after when they're 40 or something, is trying to get them out of the house and independent and earning their own living and away is actually a positive thing in parenting. Or you could see it as that way. But various things. So this synchronising with the growing year, where the plants are actually up to. And this is very much in terms of imagine you're a plant again and think what it would be like for these parsnips and these crops here. They've been out all through the winter, outside with no protection, and they've got really cold, but they can survive. So it's choosing the right crop to actually be able to do that. And that leads, I'll mention this now, but the difference between geocentric and heliocentric. So because we're all supposedly civilised and we've had thousands of years of education, we all think that we live in a universe or in a solar system with the sun at the centre of it. And of course we do, scientifically. But if you were a plant, you wouldn't know that. And you just know that you're outside and it's frosty and it's cold and you're stuck with your feet in the ground because you're not a triffid and you can't move to a warmer climate in the winter like humans do, or put the central heating on. So it's just trying to, in as many imaginative ways as possible, think yourself into that situation. And the geocentric is, imagine that Earth was the centre of the universe. I know it's not. But from plants' point of view, it is. And wherever they're set in terms of longitude and latitude, they've got to put up with it and cope or not cope. And, so it's, being exposed to that kind of direct experience outdoors rather than being looked after. So I'm going to...
So the clubs you gave us last week, I would imagine it's a fine judgment as to when to let them out then.
When to what?
When to actually have them outside, because I would imagine now it's too early.
For most things. I've not sown anything outdoors yet. And I've sown some things indoors, which I'll then harden off before I actually end up putting them outside.
So how would you harden off then? Because obviously the transition between, say, a heated house and the outside, say the justaberries.
So
got last week.
If we track forward over the next 3 months, in 3 months there's going to be no frost, it's going to be warm even at night, and therefore something that you'd grown indoors could go straight outdoors with no transition. But that's in 3 months' time. So if you start things now, in a month or 6 weeks, you'd be able to take them from a a heated place to a non-heated greenhouse in 6 weeks' time, and then they'll be okay. So, yeah, it's trying to... Yeah, let's go through these little illustrations. First, this set of circles on page 39. And that's just showing, if you know how long a plant is going to take until it crops, then you can start to predict when you need to get it going in order to have a crop at a certain point in the future, which is the Lawrence Hills sheet. And some things, just as a very rough ballpark, are going to take about 3 months: salads, radishes, leafy crops. Some things will take about 6 months, some more like 9 months, and some a whole calendar year, like parsnips. You could sow them in March and still be lifting them in March next year. And then the perennials, they'll go round as many cycles as you can keep them for, like fruit trees. And actually, I've got a pattern where I'm thinking about points in the future where I'm going to be cropping. So as I'm sowing something, I'm thinking, right, that will fill a gap in 6 months' time, that will fill a gap in 9 months' time. And it's not like a computer program where I fill absolutely every gap, but just as more that I can get going, the more I can achieve, the more I know that I'm going to get a payoff in the future. And that's why I put this thing about thinking of yourself in the future, and then you'll thank yourself in the past for doing that for you. But yeah, almost a series of loops into the future. And yeah, my mind is always set at this period of about 6 weeks. I'm thinking about 6 weeks into the future in terms of, will it be warm enough for me to plant out the things that I'm just sowing indoors now, that kind of thing. So it's trying to relate the first body of information we've got, all these different types of crop, trying to assess, are they a quick-growing salad or are they a long-growing biennial? And of course, factoring in that 3 months in the spring, from spring equinox up to midsummer, the same plant might take 6 months through the autumn, through the winter. And that's trying to factor in day length. So if we go to nearly the end of the book, page 66 roughly, and this is, I do this as a big flip chart sheet, but you can see what I've got here, which is, if we think of 2 crosses, so you've got the black cross across the year of solstices and equinoxes, the shortest day, the longest day, and the days are same as the night. That's one way of thinking about it. And that's what most of us, from our regular understanding of the calendar, are going to be starting with, our starting point. And I'll say this again, the gift that this gives you is to realign your whole conception of the year with what's going on as what the plants experience. And what the plants experience is roughly 6 weeks after that calendar date, that's when the real impact of the different times of year comes in. And to illustrate that, I'll go, so is winter solstice the coldest time of year? It's very rare that we get snow like we did this was 1 year out of 10 or 20 that we actually get snow at Christmas, because the coldest time of year is 6 weeks after the start of February in bulk. And so we're coming up to spring equinox in a couple of weeks, but there'll still be frosts, even though the days are the same as the night. There's still going to be frosts for about 6 weeks after that. So it's only at the start of May at Beltane that we can confidently sow outside, knowing that there's and plant outside, knowing there's hardly any chance of night frost. And if there is a night frost, the nights are quite short, so it doesn't penetrate as far in the plants. And then similarly, I've been out in the Peak District at Stone Circles at summer solstice, and there's a blooming frost at night in the middle of summer. But a little bit later, 6 weeks later, start of August, there's not going to be a frost then. Surely, no. Maybe rainy days and it's grotty, but not actual frost. And then similarly, in the autumn equinox, I was remembering going back to school when I was a kid, and that really annoying weather, when the weather goes really nice after you've gone back to school. It's rained all the summer holidays, and then you have to put your suit and go back to school, and it's bloody summer comes along. So, well, Manchester's another case. But yeah, the point being there that up until the 1st of November, the soil is still got the warmth from the summer, and it hasn't all been released into the atmosphere. So from a plant's point of view again, up to the 1st of November, start of November, there's still growth going on. And of course, with fruit period in the autumn, you see that happening and the changes start to happen. So it's just shifting your whole conception from the black cross to the red cross to think, well, actually, you've got 6 weeks extra to do all these things. And rather than rushing ahead in bulk and thinking, ooh, spring equinox is coming and sowing outdoors, when there's going to be loads and loads of frosts for 12 weeks after. But this period of 6 weeks, to me, I relate that to my favourite thing, which is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he's got this thing about 42 being the special number in the universe, the answer to the universe. Well, that's 6 weeks is 42 days. So maybe that's, in this case, tonight, that's the answer. So that's going, from your winter days when you get 8 hours light, if you're lucky, to your summer days when you get more than 16 hours, and just trying to adjust your practices to those different day lengths is quite an effort. The main experience that most of us will get is when we get the evenings in the next month, suddenly the days will become manageable, and rather than being pressurised to get something done in a short period of light, we'll have extra time in the evenings, and if you're workers, you'll have time to do a bit in the evening, a bit of watering extra. So that's one conception of the year. Let's turn a page to the next, and there I've got, at the bottom of that is just a slightly better presented version of that same thing. It's the difference between the pagan fire festivals and the equinoxes and solstices. They're all relevant, they're all interesting, but the pagan fire festivals in Beltane, Lammas and Samhain are more relevant from the plants and growers' perspective. And above that, it's just a record of the amount of light at different times of the year. These are kind of preparatory kind of concepts to what's coming up next. And what's coming up next is, across the page on 68, I'm trying to start off introducing these concepts that the sun is not the only factor that's relevant. So we're all aware of the sun, especially when it actually comes out from behind the clouds. But not so many of us, in, again, modern world, are aware of where the moon's up to. So anybody keep track of where the moon is at as a regular thing? Do you always know where the moon's up to? Anybody?
No.
One? That's about it.
Sometimes.
Do you know where it's up to today?
New moon.
So we've just had a new moon, so we're just a few days into the new moon. So we've just seen a tiny sliver after sunset up in the sky, on the western sky. And, the point here is we know that gravity is the most, is in some senses, the biggest force in the universe. Anybody see that Brian Cox on telly last night? Mr. Cosmic Cox. But he was pointing out that. And he also mentioned that a lot of animals time their life cycles coincide with the moon. The example he gave was the turtles that lay their eggs on a full moon in some bay somewhere, and they know exactly when the full moon is. And it's taking out electric light. Imagine a world without electric light. Suddenly, we'd all go to sleep at sunset and wake up at sunrise, which would be a good way to live, actually. But it's other things like, if we were out at night on the full moon, well, we can walk around as if it's a day. You can see almost as much as if it's daytime. But in dark moon, it's not. So we'd be much more keyed into that process of seeing the month, not as a calendar number of days, 31 days or whatever, but we'd all be fully aware that over the next couple of weeks we can stay up all night and watch the moon. And that reminded me of another bit of proof, which is the field I've worked in, which is generally care work, and I've worked with a lot of professionals, and they know that there are more admissions to psychiatric units at full moon than any other time of the month. But it's another just part of the general argument. So what I'm trying to bring us to is this point that it's not only the sun which has gravitational effect on us on the Earth. And again, if you're a plant stuck in the ground, you're much more open to these kind of extraterrestrial forces like the sun. And to explain that the moon, as it goes round the Earth, that does have a gravitational effect, and we know that because it creates the tides. And that's the process. When the moon's above, it reduces the gravitational pressure on the water in the ocean, and therefore the ocean is actually a bit higher, and that's what creates the tides. And that's balanced against, the sun also has a gravitational effect, but further away, but a much larger effect. Now the two are actually in balance. It's another one of these particular circumstances why we're here on the Earth, Brian Cox stuff, that the mass of the moon is 400 times less than the sun, but it's 400 times closer than the sun, so they actually balance each other out and cancel each other out. And then getting the difference between the full moon and the dark moon. And that's just, if my head is the Earth, and the sun is, oh look, this squash over here is the sun. Well, full moon is when we see the moon on the other side of the Earth, and it's the light of the sun reflected back to us, and we see it all. Whereas dark moon is when the moon is near the sun, and therefore we don't see it, because the light is reflected the other direction. Yeah? So, at dark moon, the sun and the moon are both on the same side of the Earth, and therefore, are pulling, affecting gravity more. And that relates to the two little wiggly bits in the middle of that page, where at full moon there are two, one by the sun, one by the moon each day, two lifting and pushing of water in the oceans, whereas at dark moon we get a combined effect where the sun and the moon are both on the same side as the Earth, and therefore water in the ocean is pulled up and pushed down just once a day. Everybody up to speed on that? So, full moon, two ups and downs, two tidal actions. Dark moon, one single big pull and push. So it's larger in its effect because they're combined. And this relates to, then, its scientific leap of thinking. We know that's happening on a gross level, on a macroscopic level, to the oceans, to all the water in the ocean. Now, just take that to the next step, which is that's also happening on a microscopic level, to every cell in your body, and to every bit of water in every cell in plants as well. And that relates, in this sense, back to think about raised beds. The water in the soil is also pulled up and pushed down by the same effect that creates the tides. So at full moon, that water is pulled up and down twice in the soil at full moon. And that means plants are almost watered from below. This is kind of easy way to grasp it, twice a day. So actually it's good for the general growing conditions. Whereas at dark moon, that water in the soil is pulled up and pushed down further. Yeah? And that makes it really good for rooting. So over the 12 hours it takes for the water to go down in the soil, well, the roots are actually following the water and being drawn down, essentially, chasing after the water. So that gives us a conclusion that, rooting is really good at dark moon. So if we're taking cuttings or transplanting, we do it just before then to get the enhanced benefit of that dark moon. And if we're trying to get things started and encourage growth, or things are just finishing and cropping and at their maximum stage of growth, that's when full moon's really good, because they're essentially getting watered from below twice a day. The water is coming up and down in the soil. So that's a coherent-ish explanation. Everybody kind of prepared to go down that route? Mm-hmm. It's got a scientific kind of rationale to it. And then that leads on to the next pages, which is the explanation of the growing calendar. And that's combining what I've just described, that process of thinking of the month as the cycle from new to full and back to dark moon. And we accept that that has some effect on plants. And that would be related to sowing seeds as many days before the full moon as it takes them to germinate. Some things will germinate really quickly, like brassicas, cabbages, just within a week they'll germinate. Some things like parsnips might take 2 or even 3 weeks to germinate. So you'd sow them a longer time before the full moon, so that they're germinating and emerging out of the soil at full moon, when they're going to be enhanced and helped. And also, that relates to a bit of general inherited learning, which is that, especially on the continent, they still harvest after full moon. So they see that as the most active time for growth, and once it's finished, plants are calmed down, and actually you're not disturbing their growth pattern. And all of this is predicated on that we are prepared to think that the world is a more complex place than we already know, that what's going on with plants is more subtle than mechanistic ideas that we use already. And this is key to biodynamic thinking, basically. And biodynamics I describe as subtle science, and it's a next stage on from organics. If we haven't done good soil improvement, then these plants aren't going to get as much effect from the moon, because they're not generally going to be able to grow, So we need to do good basic practice, and then this is something which enhances that. So that's one cycle about when we plant, when we harvest, and then just before dark moon, transplant or take cuttings. But unfortunately, the moon is not just going through that one cycle, which is about 29.5 days for the synodic new to full to dark. But there's also, there's 7 cycles of the moon. Relevant ones also is, from our perspective on the Earth, we look up at the moon and it's actually in different constellations. And constellations are just groupings of stars and parts of the solar system, the universe, the cosmos, where the moon is for that particular time. And in the course of, again, about 27.5 days, we see the moon go through all the phases of the sky, all through the constellations. Each lunar month, each 27.5 days, it'll spend about 2 or 3 days in each, what we think of as constellations. This is where we're starting to bring in a human thought. It's not a scientific thought, but it's trying to interpret. That's where all these astrological terms come in, Aquarius and Pisces and that. But I don't mean Russell, whatever his name is in the paper. It's not to do with pure speculation. This is just a marker. So people in the past and for a long time have looked up and thought, right, the moon's at that phase, or in that part of the sky, and what effect does that have on plants? And the correlation they've made is that they find that on certain days the influence is to give better leaf growth. Other days it's to give better root growth, or flower and whatever the other one is, fruiting, or forming their fruits. So this is this sideric month, which basically goes back to the 4 elements, air, earth, fire and water. It ascribes different growth processes to those different elements. So air is flower, water is leaf, fire is fruit or seed, and earth is root. And then that gives us an opportunity to do different things every 2 or 3 days, or to work with different crops every few days during that sideric month. Now, whether you take that on board, that is a leap of faith, because it relies on, did these people really do this research? There are books that have got it in. This lady, one example, she sowed radishes every day for a month, and the ones that were sown on the earth days, she got lovely big radishes. The ones that were sown on the air days went to flower without forming a root, and the ones that were leaf days had lots of leaf but no root, not a lot of root, and the fire days went to seed. So there's anecdotal evidence. Some people have actually written this up, but I'm going to say, separate from that attempt at some kind of rational explanation, what this means is, this second proposition is, that every month I've got 3 opportunities to work with all those 4 different types of crops on different days. And that means that instead of trying to do everything on one day, the first sunny day, or not knowing what I'm going to do, because there's so many things to do and I can't decide what to do, I'm actually prepared to be guided by this as some kind of system. So the way I'm looking at the next week is, tomorrow I've got an opportunity to sow seed, because it's a seed day. And then a couple of days later, so I'll just focus on probably peas and beans tomorrow, and then leave those get that done, and then a couple of days later, I'll focus on the next crop, whatever that is, roots, later in the week. And instead of overwhelming myself by trying to do everything at once and not focusing, it gives me a window of opportunity where I'm just working with those plants on those days, and if I don't quite get it done, doesn't matter. I won't stick to this religiously. I don't do anything religiously, so I might let it run over. If I don't get thing done one day, I'll move it to the next. But that allows me to think, when will I be doing certain things at roughly what time of year? So I tend to sow my squash seeds at the start of April inside a greenhouse, keep them in for 4 to 6 weeks. So at the start of April, the 3rd and the 4th of April are seed or fruit days. That's when I want to sow my squash, and that's when roughly when I normally do. So it just hones it down and gives me focus. So instead of trying to do too much or too much too early, I've got a bit of focus there. Does that interest you at all in terms of Now, the thing I'm going to say in relation to biodynamics, if you look for and find a biodynamic calendar, it is different from this. And that's because they chop up the constellations into unequal lengths. And that means you get a week of working with roots, and then 1 day of working with flowers, and then your chance is over. And also, it has got a Christian background to it. This is a lady called Maria Thun who writes this calendar. And every year around Easter, she says, don't do anything for about a week. Just when you get the time and you've got the holiday and you've got the weather behind you, you've got to sit around doing nothing. I find that too frustrating. Now, there's a value in both these approaches. And, if the proposition is, if you were only working with plants and you were there every day on your farm, and plants were the only priority you had in your life, then you'd go the whole hog and you work with the biodynamic calendar. But this reckoning, where it's 2 or 3 days for each type of crop, it really fits in with human psychology. So it's, rather than being purely plant orientated, it takes into account our human interaction with plants. That's the kind of explanation of it. And that also, moving on to having a look at the calendar. So down the right side, that's what we call the synodic month, new full dark back to dark moon. And then on each column, it runs down each column up to the full moon, which is in the middle of the column, and you've got the timing of the full moon. So that's the precise timing when the full moon goes over on the 19th of this month. It's 6:10 in the evening. And also, there are 2 other cycles on here, which I don't pay as much attention to, but do have some relevance. We can notice these. And it's what's called the anomalistic month, which is how near or far the moon is. And of course, in terms of gravity, when it's nearer, it's going to have more effect than when it's further away. And then the tropical month, which is how high or low the moon is in the sky. So if you think back to the winter we've had, on the 17th of January, and about at the same time as full moon in December last, there's the little peak point. That's when the moon was highest point in the sky. And it was very high. So it's full moon right above. By midsummer, on the 15th of June, the moon is going to be the lowest point, which means we'll see a big red moon coming up on the horizon, and it'll stay low, although it's full. So now you can start to predict and imagine what the moon's going to be like, and to keep track of it, get a sense of it. And also, the symbols here for how near and how far it is, the closest and furthest. One of the rationales for this is it gives us a different approach to the each month, each growing cycle. And so we're trying to do seed sowing in the first few days of each column at the top of the columns, and hopefully things will be germinating and emerging around about full moon. And then if we get crops that we're going to store especially, we'd harvest them in the third quarter after the full moon, which means they're going to store for longer and store better. And then just before the dark moon, that's when we do transplanting or take cuttings. So for me, it means that I can order my month, and crucially, if I'm working with other people, if they've got a bit of a grasp of that's the system I'm working to, then we can all work together and actually coordinate our activities a bit more and have a bit more sense of a structure that's not dictated by some computer program or manager, but from the plants and their interaction with gravity, that kind of thing. And I'll just give you one more, which is relevant to the end of the course, actually. I was able to start this course quite late in the year for me. I'd normally start in January, but 7th of February. And that was because it's this thing about Easter, which, according to this reckoning, is always the same date each year. Well, it's not the calendar date, but Easter is always the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. And you can actually work out when Easter is by looking at the calendar and finding actually, 19th of March is before the equinox, so we have to go to the next full moon, which is the 18th of April, and then we have to find the first Sunday after the first 18th of April, and that's going to be the 24th of April. And there has been religious schisms and dropping out over that very issue, part of the Catholic Protestant thing, but let's not go there. But yeah, that gives you a sense of when Easter is. But Easter as a date is a movable feast, therefore you can't rely on it. Therefore, the piece of information which is plant your potatoes on Good Friday is actually a load of nonsense, because that could be 6 weeks earlier or 6 weeks later in the year. The explanation is Easter is the first time that most people have a day off. So Good Friday is just the first chance you get out to go and plant anything. So let's just recap that. This is obviously quite a complex system to begin with, but once you get up and running on it, it makes it a lot easier. And this thing about windows of opportunity, you get completely bamboozled and you get all your seed packets and what I'm going to sow, but dividing your seeds into these different categories and thinking, what crop am I aiming to plant here? So if it's a squash, it fits into that fire, fruit and seed category. If it's a parsnip or some carrot, that's going to be we want to grow a root. And so you try and think about the crops that you're growing in terms of what crop you're after at the end of it: leaf, fruit, flower, fruit, whatever the other one is, and then work with, i.e. sow, transplant, and harvest on the relevant days. The more you can do it, the better. And part of that is, like I say, it's just given a window of opportunity, some kind of system that you're working to, that takes that decision-making process out of, stops it clogging your brain up. So you won't all turn into pagans by doing this. But, just to recap, the most crucial bit of information is this point about comparing and contrasting the calendar date with the growing date, the soil warmth. And that's also, on that explanation at the top, it's just the contrast that there's a 6-week delay throughout the year between where we think we're up to by looking at the calendar compared to where the soil and the plants are up to, which will be about 6 weeks later. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think you mostly look kind of stunned and scratch heads.